today I'm joined by comedian Angela Barnes. Good afternoon, Angela.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very, very well. Look, Angela, I'm going to ask you the same question that I've been asking the listeners. Books that you perhaps have claimed to have read, but not quite got through to the end.
So many. I mean, my bookcase is full of... I'm a serial book buyer, but the
Me
problem is,
too.
Alexis, well, I've got ADHD, you see, so I'm very good at starting books, not so good at finishing them. But I found out recently about, do you know about Umberto Eco's anti-library theory? So
No.
the philosopher Umberto Eco has this theory, he calls it the anti-library, where actually intelligent people will have more books than they can read, and just the knowledge being accessible to them is enough to show their intelligence. So that's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to join you with that one because I'm a serial book buyer. I love bookshops. I always want to have a book. But do I read all of them? Hardly ever. But I like to have them.
That's the problem, though, isn't it? Because I love buying new books. As soon as I bought a new book, I lose interest in the last new book I bought. I want to read the one I've just bought, so the cycle goes on.
The shiny one, the new one, the shiny one.
Exactly, the one that smells nice.
Look, before we should touch upon the Sue Gray story before we look at all the other stories we've got to talk about. What do you make of everything? I mean, I've been trying very, very hard, Angela, to stay away from, it's a whitewash, it's a conspiracy, it's everyone working together. I mean, you've got the Cabinet Office appointed by the Prime Minister, works for the Prime Minister. The Met Police, again, Dame Cressida Dick, appointed by the Prime Minister. Two organisations that come together and come to a conclusion that is very convenient, let's say, for the Prime Minister. It's very easy to start talking about conspiracy and whitewash, and I don't want to go down that way. I don't believe that is the case. I think there's more incompetence than conspiracy most of the times. What's your take?
Same, really. I mean, you do start to wonder what have they got on Cressida Dick that she's so compliant with, but I just, it's so hard to know, like you say, what is conspiracy and what is incompetence, because let's be honest, I don't look at the government that's in power now and think that it's not going to be incompetence, that causes these problems. So either way, it's unsettling. It's so hard to know what to think, and I've started referring to Sue Gray as Goddo because I don't think it's starting to feel like it's never actually gonna come. Something. It feels like they're just waiting for something else to break. War in Russia would be quite ideal for Boris now, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's terrible to think that, and it's terrible.
It really is.
But do you think? Just one last question before we sort of move on from Sue Gray, because I think people would quite like to hear about something else. But one last question: do you think that it is worth Sue Gray releasing a report without the bits that are serious enough for the Met Police to be looking into? Is the report worth the paper it's written on without those?
It's so frustrating, isn't it? Because without knowing what's in the report, that's sort of impossible to answer. And I would hope that, the things that show the government to be any illegal doings, obviously, are, if they're culpable of those, then Boris Johnson has to go. Now, if those things are the things that are going to be omitted because they're part of an ongoing investigation, I would hope that there's still enough in there that shows that, things that aren't illegal but are still show distrust, or that still prove that Boris Johnson lied. That might not be things that are illegal, but if he's shown to still have lied. So there's still things that could come out in the report that might be enough to go, hang on a minute, this can't go on. But it's so hard to tell, and it's so frustrating, the whole thing.
Let's move on to another story then. Move away from all things Sue Gray. Oh, that sounded good. Let's talk about this report. It's the front cover of the Times today, and it's the US sounding alarm over Russian cash in London, and they are basically saying, look, it's going to be very difficult to hit Putin where it hurts, i.e., where the money is, and the people who support Putin, who, let's remind ourselves, Putin and his supporters don't keep their money in Russia. They keep it outside of Russia. And the idea has always been to try and block that money. But the US are saying they fear that they will be unable to impose effective sanctions on President Putin if Russia invades Ukraine because of years of British tolerance of suspect money flooding into London. That's a pretty hefty accusation there.
It is. And it's, you can't deny that. I mean, obviously NATO, it's one in, all in, but if you've got one of your members who has, I mean, it was David Cameron, I think, and William Hague when he was Foreign Secretary, who opposed sanctions because of this very reason, because London was becoming a financial centre to Russians. So it does cause a problem for NATO. It does cause a problem for the US if we've got previous of going, hang on a minute, everyone cool down, because of the economic interests that Russia has in Britain. And these sanctions on the Russian economy, things that might damage the Russian economy. Well, if all of the super rich people in Russia have their money in London, then do what you like to the Russian economy as far as they're concerned. So it's this all began really way back in when Russia first annexed Crimea, and David Cameron and I think William Hague had to take responsibility of at that point going, hang on a minute, guys, let's think about this before we do anything too hasty. And now that's coming back to bite us, really.
Do you notice it? I mean, I have to say, as someone who lives in London, I do notice that London has become a sort of a millionaire's playground. There are things in London that are excruciatingly expensive without sort of needing to be so. Even if you're going to go out for a very expensive meal, the prices are ridiculous. And when you ask the question why, the answer is always, well, because there are people who live in London who can afford to pay those, £800 for a plate of steak, or you see all these places. And I understand that people want to spend some money. There's a little bit of luxury. But it seems that in London, there are some parts of London that are purposefully built for people to spend obscene amounts of money.
Yeah. I mean, I don't live in London, but I'm in Brighton. I'm in London a lot. And I do, I suppose that's ever been thus, go back to the Great Exhibition and you had the people of Knightsbridge getting terribly upset that all the poor people are going to be traipsing through their neighbourhoods. It's always been a them and us in London. But I think that this kind of, it's very difficult to be poor in London. I was a student nurse in London, and I think when we talk about the poverty in this country, we very much focus on maybe cities up north, or don't get me wrong, obviously have problems with poverty. It's everywhere. But it's exceptionally hard to be poor in London, where the cost of living is so high. And then you end up, of course, driving out your key workers. You end up driving out, a nurse can't afford to buy a house in London. If you're, somebody with a relatively good, I can't afford to buy a house in London. That's why I moved out, and I've got no children, no dependents, and have a relatively well-paid job. So there's no doubt that London is not a place that is viable for most normal, for want of a better word, people, and I know there's a problem with property being bought up with, by oligarchs or whoever, or lots of property standing empty. And it's a huge issue. And it's our capital city that people can't afford to live in. And that's a big problem. And in other European capitals, there are rent controls, there are ways of mitigating that. And we don't seem to have that here.
It's going to be a problem that, we've known the problem is there, but whether or not it's going to be addressed or not, who knows? But perhaps with the US pointing it out and saying, well, look, we'd love to sanction these people, but if you're going to keep allowing them to move their money into your economy, then something needs to be done. One quick story, Angela, which I had to read over and over again because I thought, I checked the date, wasn't April 1st, but I just thought this makes zero sense. North Korea named chair of the UN Disarmament Conference.
Oh, sometimes jokes just write themselves, don't
they?
Really
do.
I mean, it's like having Salt Bay chair a vegan conference. It feels like just. But when I actually thought about it, I think it makes some sense because, look, Kim Jong-un is doing missile tests. He wants to be a nuclear power. He wants to show his nuclear capability. And we know he's a man who responds to flattery, right? Yeah. So, he's a man who wants to be at the diplomatic table. He's made that very clear. And I feel like, and I sort of understand that. I feel like nuking something when I don't get invited to the evening do at a wedding. I understand that sort of wanting to be. And so while it seems so counterintuitive to go, how can you make these, they're doing missile tests, they're not following sanctions, whatever. How can they be chairing a disarmament conference. But I think it does make sense because he responds to flattery. And look, North Korea are obsessed with military power. It's hard to get them to disarm. It's like getting a football hooligan to take up knitting. It's you've got to use other methods, and just sitting around a table and hoping is not going to be good enough. Put him at the head of the table, flatter him, make him feel important. I think it makes sense when you think about it.
You want him inside the tent rather than outside the tent.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
I have to say that for people thinking, well, perhaps this is some sort of Mickey Mouse conference, it isn't. The Conference of Disarmament is billed as the world's single multilateral forum for disarmament negotiations. And out of previous meetings, you had the international agreements such as the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons came out of that disarmament conference, one of those disarmament conference, and the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Both huge treaties that came from those conferences. But I think you're right. I think bringing people in the room is probably the best way to go, giving them the responsibility and sometimes gritting your teeth, and biting your tongue and giving them that respect that they so crave, but perhaps don't really deserve. Why on earth is he playing the Harry Potter tune, I hear you ask? Well, Angela, what a strange story this is. And again, it's one of those stories that you read and you think, surely not, let's not all get too excited. Anyway, here are the facts of the story. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. University of Chester puts trigger warning on Harry Potter, Hunger Games and Northern Lights. The university has issued trigger warnings to students reading those books, claiming it could lead to difficult conversations about gender, race, sexuality, class and identity. It feels like, Angela, it's one of those stories that is there to make us all a little bit upset. Yeah, go on. What do you make of it?
Well, I find that the whole thing with people getting upset about trigger warnings fascinating, because it feels like they get so upset by it that we're going to get to a stage where we have to have trigger warnings that there's a trigger warning.
Yes.
That sort of people getting themselves in a knot, and I genuinely can't see and it's because people get themselves in a state about trigger warnings that we end up in a situation where they start to feel a bit absurd, because it draws attention. Then it then becomes a story and people get the attention that they want to their story. So I do think that I personally cannot see the problem with trigger warnings, right? Because the thing is, if you think they're unnecessary, ignore them. Like, you could just ignore them. And lucky you that in your life you haven't got some sort of trauma that you don't want to be confronted with, and be surprised by. Good for you. That's great. So just don't take any notice of them. They're there, you can ignore them. Whereas there is no doubt that there are people that have been through things in their life that you can't understand unless you have, and that maybe a piece of work that discusses those topics that you weren't expecting to you might want to make the decision, actually, I'm going to avoid that, right? And that's your right to do that, but you need to know. And I do think sometimes, some of the people that get upset by trigger warnings are the same people that will, come to see one of my stand-up shows, say, and then complain because I swear too much. And I say, well, do you know what? If there'd been a trigger warning, then you wouldn't have come and it would all been fine, wouldn't it? Do you know what I mean? So look, everyone gets offended by certain things. People deal with it in different ways. And I know there is a sort of a kickback against being offended. They say, well, people being offended is silly or whatever. But there's a difference between being offended by the sake of it, being offended by maybe my effing and jeffing, or actually just having been through a trauma that you just don't want to be reminded of. And I think that's the difference. And by making a big fuss about there being trigger warnings, that's what's drawn all this attention, and why people on both extremes of the debate can then hold it up and go, well, look at this idiot, look at this idiot. Where actually, I just think in the middle somewhere, people going, well, that's good to warn people that they might be talking about a topic that, they might not want to, the sort of, we apply some kind of rationality to it. There's bigger things to worry about in the world.
What do you think that the people who get angry about trigger warnings, for example, Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen's been particularly critical of this story. What do you think that they're upset about? As you said, trigger warnings are there for people who might need them. I've got a 15-year-old daughter. She had an incident where she, out of the blue, got very upset about something because they were talking about death, and a member of our family had passed away, and it triggered, some unpleasant reaction for her in a classroom. Now, no one's saying you need to put a trigger warning in a biology lesson, but what do you think the people who get upset about these things, what are they actually upset about? What's Andrew Bridgen actually upset about? Or people like Andrew Bridgen, he's not here to defend himself.
No.
We can't figure out what he thinks, but what do you think upsets those people?
I think it all comes from this sort of, these so-called culture wars that have sprung up, and that you have to take a side, and that you're either on the side of, your woolly snowflakes or your free speech warriors, whereas actually most of us exist somewhere in the middle. And, sometimes we find things offensive because we're human beings and they offend our sensibilities for whatever reason. And how you then process that is well. But what we've got now is people that are very vociferous about these points because it helps them to forward, be it their political career, be it their other agendas. So we end up with this sort of culture war, which for most of us just living our lives simply doesn't exist. This idea that, people are getting cancelled for saying X, Y, Z, and go, all these so-called people that have been cancelled have outlets all over the blooming place. Like, it's just not, it's not the problem that people think it is, but by identifying it as a problem, what you can then do is divide people into these two sets or these two sides of a war that doesn't really exist, and this is all part of that, I think. And by going, look at these triggered snowflakes over there, when actually the ones making more fuss are the people against the trigger warnings. The whole thing is sort of, you look at Twitter and you feel like this is some big hot topic that everyone's talking about, whereas most people, it doesn't matter. And
I think even the swearing, as you said, I think the idea of the terminology used around, like trigger warnings, I think it's what you said in the very beginning. You need a trigger warning about the trigger warning. And I think it's just the word trigger warning. Because when you watch a film, it does say contains violent language, violent images, the very beginning of the film, in the certification.
Exactly.
You could say that is a trigger warning.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same message.
It's in the same way the word woke, the word trigger have now become triggers in themselves to a certain demographic or certain people with certain political aims, to then go, look, see, they're being woke, and make this black and white argument for something that isn't black and white, that we all live in the grey area in the middle. And, it's this sort of fake argument that really benefits a small number of people. And so people are being trained to look for the word trigger warning, to look for the word woke and go, that must be a bad thing.
Yeah. Speaking about trigger warnings, let's talk about Donald Trump. Donald Trump. In fact, we've got a little clip to play for Donald Trump.
Good. I really missed him.
I know, we all have. Here's what happened when Donald Trump was lining up for when he was golfing. He was lining up for his drive shot on a recent golf outing.
First on tee, 45th President of the United States.
45th and 47th.
47th. Yes.
I love that.
Mr. Donald Trump. Ladies and gentlemen. Beautiful.
Of course, Donald Trump was the 45th president of the United States, Joe Biden 46th, and now Donald Trump saying he's going to be the 47th. Angela, is he? Do you think he's going to run?
I mean, I have to say the most disappointing thing about that clip is that apparently he then drove the ball down the fairway, but that's the moment when you really want him to mess up that shot. And after that, you really want him to just miss it completely. But anyway, who knows? I mean, you could look at this that it's a step forward, that he's finally accepted he isn't president number 46. So, in some ways, maybe it's a bit of a step forward for Donald Trump. Will he run again? I mean, it's in his interest to keep himself in the headlines. He's a self-publicist. Does he really want to be president again? Did he really want to do the work of being president in the first place? Or is he someone who's quite happy to go, hey, I was president. Okay, the way, only serving one term or whatever, he's got something to prove. And he's obviously a man who, likes to prove himself right. Who knows? I think it's likely that he'll put himself forward as a candidate. I think, yeah, we'll see. And that's the first indication that he's sort of, said it to a camera. And
well, what we can be sure about is Donald Trump being Donald Trump. He's never going to give you a straight answer about anything, even if he knows he's definitely not going to run because he's got other plans. He's not going to tell us. As you said, he's going to keep himself in the headlines right up until the very end because he enjoys being in the spotlight. And as far as we know, he still has quite a lot of the Republican Party behind him. And so will we. We're going to leave Donald Trump behind us because we don't want to talk about him anymore. Let's talk about someone that you spend time with. And I want to talk about Barry Cryer. Yesterday, we heard of the passing of the comedy legend Barry Cryer as he died at the age of 86.
It's your turn now, Barry, and I'd like you to sing the words of I Predict a Riot by the Kaiser Chiefs to the tune of A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square.
Watching the people get leery, it's not very pretty, I tell thee. Walking through town is quite scary, it's not very sensible either.
I'm in a four-man pub quiz team with a butcher, a baker, and a candlestick maker.
I mean, if you wrote something that you knew Eric and Ernie were going to do, and they accepted it, you knew it was going to be done immaculately and brilliantly, And people often say to me and others, isn't it frustrating being a writer? I said, no, I couldn't be them. 100 years, I was a backroom boy. That's what you did. That was your job.
You know about the guy who shot a golden eagle?
No.
Preserved species.
Yeah.
And he was in court in front of a magistrate. And the magistrate said, this is a dreadful thing. He said, I never intended to. I was shooting pheasants and it flew into my line of fire. Complete accident. So the magistrate said, OK. And he said, as a matter of interest, what did you do with it? He said, I ate it. The magistrate said, good God, what did it taste like? He said, rather like swan.
Angela, did you spend time with Barry?
I did get to work with him a few times. And the thing about Barry Cryer is, you say he's from another generation, but he's not. He just carried through many generations.
Yeah.
And what he did when alternative comedy came around, and a lot of those sort of older comics didn't quite understand it and didn't quite get it, Barry Cryer just loved comedy and he loved embracing all of it. And that's why, the alternative comics of the 80s right through to new comics today are so fond of him, because he never sort of sneered at anyone. I remember the first time I did a show with him, it was a fundraiser for something, and I was amazed that he even bothered watching us. I was like, you're Barry Cryer, why aren't you just sitting in the bar until it's your turn to go on? But you watched it all, and I came off stage, and when he said, I like that joke you did about what, and it was just blew my mind. And having Barry Cryer say he likes one of your jokes is a feeling like no other. And I remember doing, quite often I do, there used to be an annual gig in memory of Linda Smith. And I hosted it one year, and it was at the Cambridge Theatre in London, and Barry was on the bill. And I was really nervous because there's a lot of legends on the bill, and it's Linda Smith, and one of the people that was supposed to be on the bill was Jeremy Hardy. And Jeremy Hardy at this point was very poorly. Now, we knew he was very poorly, but the public didn't at this point. And I had to, as the MC, people were expecting him to be there, and he really wanted to be there, but sort of a couple of days before, he just wasn't well enough. And so he sent me something to read out, a statement to read out. And again, in the statement was all about how much Jeremy loved Linda. And, but of course I was reading it knowing how unwell Jeremy was. And it was quite emotional to have to do that. And I came off stage and Barry was just waiting there, to just go, well done. I know that was hard. Well done. And just kind of, he was so supportive and just so funny. I mean, I've got a lot of comedian friends on Facebook, and my feed for the last 2 days has just been full of anecdotes, some repeatable, some not. But all of them just about how funny he was, how generous he was, how kind he was. And that is, he had comedy in his blood. He lived it. And that's why he couldn't ever hang his boots up, because it's what kept him going. And being around young comics kept him going as well. He was just a really special man.
Oh, Angela, thank you so much for spending the time with us and for sharing your memories as well of Barry. Really appreciate it. And it's been great fun sitting
Thank you for having me.
and chatting through the news with you. Thanks so much. We look forward to having you back on very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexis. Have a nice weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers. That's Angela Barnes. Plenty of you have been getting...